Our discussion in this video centers on resistance to the laws and policies put into place during the segregation era, that is in the 19 teens, 20s, and 30s. And one of the considerations that we ought to take into account here is the division among those who were oppressed under this discriminatory legislation. And, if looking at this in a superficial way, one might say, well, why don't the black Africans and the colored or Griqua population and the Indians just unite in their efforts to oppose these laws and policies? But that superficial kind of take on this, I think, misunderstands some of the key aspects of the system of racial division that was put into place in South Africa. It was designed not only to discriminate against and oppress those who were not white, but also to divide them from each other. And this extended beyond just this kind of tripartite division among the people who were discriminated against. It also, the white government also did divide up Africans against each other. They tried to create policies that made it so Zulus and Xhosa and Sotho and Swana and Venda and Pedi and Shangani and so forth would not come together in any kind of protest or any kind of resistance. Those efforts ended up failing for the most part, though there are exceptions, as we'll see. But with this threefold division, these three had a very difficult time finding common ground. There were, historic rivalries between the three groups. Demographically, they existed in different areas of the country. The colored population, for instance, and by colored we understand that's the mixed race people descended from the offspring of unions between mostly white farmers and the Khoisan or Khoikhoi peoples of the Cape all the way back into the 17th century, right? The colored population lived almost entirely in the Cape. Often in communities that were made up entirely of colored people. They spoke Afrikaans. They were mostly converts to Christianity, though there were some, even among their leadership, in some cases there were Muslims and others, but mostly Christian, and they had really absorbed European culture. They did not identify very well with Africans. They even brought with them, as a kind of inheritance from their white ancestors, a lot of racist feeling against the Bantu Africans. The Indian population was, by contrast, was confined almost entirely to Natal, in the city of Durban and the areas around that. Some were in the rural setting as well, and was a far more transitory population. Indians, they didn't come and go necessarily, but they, many of them, did migrate back to India. Mohandas Gandhi is an example. He lived in South Africa from 1893 to 1915. And although he organized the Indians to oppose things like pass laws and other discriminatory legislation, his efforts were confined to trying to create a better existence for the Indian population. He did not collude in any instance with black Africans, and indeed his rhetoric suggested that they were not deserving of anything other than the discrimination that they suffered. In any case, there was not a lot of collusion between these three groups at this point, and we will see that they do begin to come together to oppose apartheid, but not until that system had been in place for some time. During the First World War, the soldiers from South Africa who fought under the command of Jan Smuts and others were mostly white. There were combatant units made up of colored South Africans. Blacks were employed by the army mostly as unarmed laborers. There were, in fact, thousands of them sent. They didn't fight only in Africa. They were sent in some cases to Europe. Um, Over 5,000 blacks died in the war, though they were they were almost entirely unarmed. Right. The whites tended to get very angry at even the argument that blacks ought to be uh, armed or employed as combat troops. The colored contingent who did fight were subject to a lot of discrimination and a kind of white backlash against the creation of their combat unit. And so when the war was over, these black and colored soldiers were often just summarily dismissed without any recognition for what they had done for the country or any long lasting benefits to their service. And this created a lot of tension between the different communities, and of course, as we've talked about, among the whites, um, there was a lot of fear about the experience that the blacks had in the First World War, and this is one of the things that led to um, the decrease in popularity of the Botha and Smuts governments, and the rise in popularity of figures like J.B.M. Hertzog. Under the system of segregation, especially with the creation of the native reserves, which we talked about in the last lecture, chiefs or headmen in these African societies were designated as the leaders of these Bantu African communities. And this, and I think I've talked about this already in some of the earlier parts of the course, this was a fundamental misreading of the place that the chief actually held in these African societies. Under the system of political power, as we've noted, and this is kind of for all of sub-Saharan Africa, but South Africa in particular also participated in this kind of trend. The chief was more of an arbiter and a moderator of community needs. The wielding of political power was done in what might be called almost a more democratic way, right, than the sort of autocracy that the segregation era system called for. And so the chief was viewed by the white community as the absolute authority in these reserves. And he was the only one that the white government would negotiate with. But then, from below, so to speak, within the community, the chief was not acknowledged as the representative of everyone. And so these chiefs were put into a terribly uncomfortable, compromised position. They weren't necessarily respected absolutely by their people, but they were treated as absolute authorities by the white government. And so, to be successful, a chief had to both manipulate the more kind of communal and democratic parts of running their local communities, while at the same time function in effective ways vis-a-vis the white government. Most chiefs really kind of failed at doing this. They were not very successful. And this led to a lack of cohesion in the African response, especially in the reserves. In the cities and in the growing townships in the urban areas, the leadership, which was not reliant on the system of chiefs, was often far more effective, or at least far more organized than it was in the reserves. Right? Because so many adult male Bantu Africans left the reserves to seek employment in the mines or in the manufacturing center in the cities, kinship systems were disrupted, and traditional kind of hierarchies of power, which often ran along age lines, were disrupted. Young men who had, under the old system, been excluded from, seeking wives at an early age, organizing any sort of, socially cohesive uh, organizations within the African communities, because pride of place was given to the older, more established men. They were able to do such things in a way that hadn't been done previous to this time. And when the older men would return home from working, they would find that their position was compromised, and so this was just tremendously disruptive in a number of ways. Education in the African communities was, until the 1940s or so, almost entirely in the hands of missionary societies. They did enroll hundreds of thousands of Bantu students every year, but due to the lack of resources, they were not supported at all, or very little, by the South African government, and the missionary societies, even though they had at times wealthy sponsors in Britain, or if it was, there were some Catholic agencies, they had some funding from Rome, but to handle the demands of the mass number of black Africans who were seeking education, they simply did not have those sorts of resources. And so, for the most part, the education was confined to the elementary levels. The South African education system starts with these elementary grades. The equivalent of kindergarten and first grade are called grade 1 and grade 2. And from there, they have standards 1 through 10. So the vast majority of all students in the missionary system were confined to, at most, standard 6 and lower. That would be 8th grade and lower. And in fact, and this is from the Thompson book, in a kind of census of black students taken in the mid 1930s. Over half of them were only enrolled in the bottom 2 levels, right? And most of the rest in sort of scattered between standards 1 through 6. So many Africans, even if they were able to get some kind of education, only got maybe 2, 3, 4 years at most before they were sent to work. And there was little effort put into any kind of legislation that would mitigate the tendency toward child labor. Right. This is in the same era when child labor laws were being put firmly into place in Western countries. There was no concern on the part of the South African government to do the same, especially when it came to African laborers. Higher education was in short supply. There were a few notable schools that catered to natives. By far the most important of these, in terms of people who went through it, the notable alumni, so to speak, was the South African Native College in Fort Hare, which was in the Ciskei Reserve, which was in mostly a Xhosa area, just outside of East London. And the slide has a picture of the main building of Fort Hare, as you can see from the label there. The alumni who went through Fort Hare, and they were drawn not only from South Africa, but from all of kind of Central and Southern Africa, included such luminaries as Nelson Mandela and Oliver Tambo, who of course led the ANC during its exile. We'll talk about Tambo later. But also figures like Z.K. Matthews, who was received a law degree from Yale University and became a lecturer in law at Fort Hare himself in the 40s and 50s, and one of the leaders of the Native Conference that was supposed to represent African interests during this period. But in addition to that, people like, well, Julius Nyerere, who became the first president of Tanzania, was a graduate of Fort Hare. Robert Sobuse, who was the founder of the Pan-African Congress, which we'll talk about later, he was a graduate of Fort Hare. Mangosuthu Buthelezi, who formed the Inkatha Freedom Party, was an alumnus of Fort Hare. Robert Mugabe, who led the freedom struggle, the Zimbabwe African National Union Patriotic Front leader, who ended up being the first president of a democratic Zimbabwe, later a kind of autocratic ruler who held on to power for far too long. Right? He was he was an alumnus of Fort Hare. Okay, so these places did produce a trickle, but not an insignificant number, ultimately, of highly educated individuals. But there were just very few jobs for such people, right? So we see the emergence of an intelligentsia, but for the most, I mean, for almost entirely shut out of any opportunity for advancement in a career that would take advantage of the education they received. Most of them went on to become ministers of churches or teachers in these missionary schools. Some of them became lawyers or physicians or others held other jobs, but those were almost entirely limited to whites, even working in law and medicine in the reserves. Right, whites would tend to hold those positions, and so this intelligentsia was stuck, was caught. And this was true in other parts of Africa as well. But with the system of segregation and discrimination being put into place in South Africa, this was especially acute for the intelligentsia there. Now, resistance came really from a couple of different quarters organizationally in South Africa. One of these was among African churches. And I'll take time in the live session to read some writings of one of the leaders of these churches. We'll talk more about them later in the course. There were a number of what were called Zionist churches that developed in the 1920s and 30s in South Africa. These often preached a rather apocalyptic message, similar to that of Nonkawuse, who we talked about among the Xhosa in the 1850s. Though not, to the extent of killing all their cattle or anything like that, but they did talk about a kind of millennial deliverance by Jesus of the African community, and these became hotbeds for discontent and protest in the segregation era and into the apartheid era. So more about that later. I want to spend most of the rest of the time here, the next few minutes, talking about the political organizations that were formed in this period. There are three main political parties that we'll discuss. The first of these is the African Political Organization, which was formed among the colored community. In the Williams book, we have a document written by Abdullah Abdurrahman, who was one of the founders and the early leaders of the APO. And this is highly revealing of the leadership in general of these early political organizations. Abdurrahman himself was a highly educated person, an intellectual, and his rhetoric here, and this is something he wrote in 1913, so the organization had existed for over a decade at this point. And this, he's talking about the unfair treatment, the discrimination against the colored people whom he represents here, but he's doing it in a way that, draws upon European rhetoric and tries to appeal to the kind of the better instincts, as it were, of the white population, or what Abdurrahman felt should be the better instincts of the white population. Right, and so in other words, this is he is using the language of Western education to try to appeal to the white community, and I'm not going to take time to read much of this. The document itself is not very long; it's only a few paragraphs. But he says at the beginning, Um, if Europeans have duties toward the colored people, what else is implied than the need for humane dealings? This, by the way, is page 213 of the Williams book. And endeavors to ameliorate their lot and uplift them in the scale of civilization. If that is what their duties mean, let us ask how far they have fulfilled them. I want to pay special attention there to the word uplift, right? This was common rhetoric all over the Western world. This is something that was used by, among others, Booker T. Washington in the United States in the late 19th, early 20th century, right? This is what the renowned scholar Ibram Kendi, who writes about the history of racism in America, calls uplift suasion. And here we find it, in a leader of a political organization in South Africa, right? That it is the duty of the white person to lift up the non-white and to have humane feelings toward him or her. But he goes on to point out, instead of kindly, humane treatment, we find barbarous cruelty and inhumanity. Instead of ameliorating our lot, they endeavor to accentuate its bitterness. Instead of aiming to our upliftment, they seek to degrade us, right? So this criticism comes from a kind of highly intellectual space. And that is characteristic, I think, of the leadership of not only the APO, but also these other early political parties, right? The other two, the South African Indian Congress was formed in Natal in 1923, representing almost entirely Indian interests, protesting against the white government treatment of the Indian population. For our purposes, the most important political party formed in this period was the South African Native National Congress, which was later shortened to just the African National Congress. This was formed in 1912. All of the early leaders were educated intellectuals, some of them from Fort Hare, some of them had sought education either in England or the United States. And so, they were either clergymen or teachers, or in some cases newspaper editors. And their strategy, like that of Abdurrahman, was to appeal to the better instincts of the European population, especially the British. The ANC recognized they really could not work with the Afrikaners. That was a dead-end road. But they thought they could appeal to the British. They thought the British presence there was a good thing. They sort of harkened back to the good old days of Cecil Rhodes and Alfred Milner, and felt that if the British were in charge, that things would be much better in South Africa. And so, their early strategy was to, well, in some cases even, go directly to Britain. The picture here is of a delegation sent by the ANC, or the SANNC as it was called at that point, to London. This includes, by the way, a couple of the early founders. This is John Dubé right here in the middle. He was a minister and the first president of the organization. This is Solomon Platier, who was a newspaper editor and writer of some sophistication, a highly educated individual, who was I think the title was Secretary General of the ANC at the beginning. Another leader was Pixley Sakaseme, also a similarly educated. I think he had actually a law degree, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, he had a law degree. I just found it in my notes. A law degree from Columbia University, and had actually studied law at Oxford. Right. So, these are men who were plugged into higher education along the Western model. The strategy to appeal to the better instincts of the Europeans failed utterly. Right, the delegation that was sent to London was told by the colonial secretary that there was absolutely nothing he could do. The ANC sent a delegation to Versailles in 1919 to try to participate in the Versailles Conference at the end of the First World War. and they were entirely shut out of any negotiation. They were not recognized as representative of anyone, and they spent their time there just trying to find any kind of audience they could and failing at that. Right. And so, there was the ANC membership remained very small at the beginning. It was confined mostly to educated people. The common people simply did not see the ANC as representing their interests or having anything in common with them. And that feeling was mutual. Some ground was gained, or at least greater representation was found in more radical movements. I'll mention two. The first of these is called the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union, founded in 1928 by a guy who came from what was called then Nyasaland, what is now called Malawi. Worked as a dock worker in Cape Town, started by forming a union among them, and this grew to become a nationwide movement. It was active in the urban areas, but it was even more active in the rural setting. This guy's name was Clemens Cadelie. There's another document in the Williams book that I'll reference here. This starts on page 233. And we can see in this document the difference in approach here of the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union. Short for that is ICU, so I'm going to be referring to ICU here. This is far more direct. Now, Clemens Cadelie was educated to some extent. He writes with a kind of flair, but the approach is far more direct, right? It is referencing the laws passed by the white government and the objections that the Africans have toward them, right? And so he says, for instance, second paragraph on page 234, this conference of organized native and colored people, and so they claim to represent not only the black Africans, but also the colored population, and they did draw some membership from that, is of the opinion that passes, no matter what shape or form, are nothing more or less than an institution of the present capitalist system of government to reduce the African workers to a state of abject servility so as to facilitate their utmost exploitation. And further, this conference condemns the proposals of the Joint Council of Europeans and Natives intended for submission to the Prime Minister. But in the opinion of this conference, the only alternative is the abolition of the past system. Right, so this is far more direct, and they go on to challenge the Industrial Conciliation Act of 1924, which we talked about in the last lecture, which excluded Africans from the designation as employees, so they could not organize themselves or be represented in any way by organized labor, right? And so, this document, in this document, Cadelie attacks that directly. He did, he reserved his criticism not only for the white government, but also for the ANC, these intelligentsia who ran these political organizations. And the ICU ended up drawing a membership in the 1920s of as many as 200,000 African workers, including some of the colored population, right? So this was far more effective at mobilizing people. Unfortunately, a combination of white suppression and corruption within the organization, Cadelie himself drew what was considered a fairly sizable salary, equal to that of something like 30 times what the average laborer made, right? So Cadelie was ultimately, when these things came to light, he was viewed as out of touch with people and as corrupt. The government, and we'll talk about this later, this is one of those points where the government said that the Africans, given their uncivilized status, could not possibly understand or be benefited by anything so Western and so civilized as a labor union, so they could not have them. And they used that rhetoric to suppress the ICU. And by the 1930s, this thing was mostly defunct, had mostly run its course. Another organization I'll mention here is the South African Communist Party. This never reached any very large numbers, but it did, like the ICU, take a far more direct approach to the problem of discrimination. Some of the early leaders of the South African Communist Party journeyed to the Soviet Union in the 1920s and came back with glowing reviews of that country and the conditions that were created there. This was pre-Stalin, by the way. Uh, and so, in that way, the SACP gained some popularity, though like I said, it remains small. One of the things about the SACP is and communism in general, this was to be post-racial. This was not a black African organization. The SACP sent out feelers to anyone who was interested in a more fair and just system according to the interpretations of Marx and Lenin, the proletariat uprising, taking control of the means of production, and all of that, right? So that was their rhetoric. The SACP. This is following a general trend in the 1920s, the formation of communist parties all over the world, in Europe and in other places, right? So this is not out of keeping with that, and its appeal was really quite limited. Though the SACP is going to hang around, and we'll see it does play a role in the anti-apartheid struggle, and really kind of joins arms, as it were, with the ANC. In the 1930s, there were meetings. Occasions when leaders of these different parties would come together to try to achieve some solidarity. The little solidarity they were able to achieve was quashed for the most part by the white government, right? So this is still an embryo, and for the most part, these organizations were pretty ineffectual. And we'll see in the 1940s they're going to be challenged by young people who joined the organizations, and with this infusion of youth, they they became more popular, and really more representative of the desires of the population, right? So this is a story to be continued.